Right now, your dog is lying on the couch. Maybe he's asleep. Maybe he's doing that thing where one eye is half open and you can't tell if he's watching you or just existing in some warm, boneless, in-between state. Either way, he looks comfortable. He looks content. And if you asked most people whether he's aware of being alive, they'd say yes, obviously. Look at him. Here's the thing, though. We don't actually know that. We assume it. We project it. We buy them birthday cakes and hold funerals for goldfish and talk to houseplants in a tone would be embarrassed to explain. We are, as a species, almost pathologically convinced that the other living things around us have some kind of inner life. And honestly, that instinct might be right, but it also might be the most elaborate self-deception in the history of conscious thought, which is a sentence I did not expect to write today. Because here's what nobody really asks. Not the version of the question you think I mean, but the actual version. Does your dog know he's alive? Not just that he exists, not just that he's warm and fed and his ears feel like velvet, but that there is something it is like to be him. That somewhere behind those eyes experience is happening, that the lights are on. In 2012, a group of the world's leading neuroscientists signed a document called the Cambridge Declaration on Consciousness. It stated, officially, that non-human animals possess the neurological substrates that generate consciousness. Which sounds like a landmark. Which sounds like science finally settling something. Except what it actually did was blow the question wide open. Because if animals are conscious, if they genuinely experience their lives, then almost everything we think we know about them needs a second look. Your dog is still on the couch. He hasn't moved. And suddenly that's a completely different image than it was 30 seconds ago. Before we get to animals, let's try something closer to home. Can you prove that I'm conscious? Not that I'm behaving as if I am. Not that I'm producing outputs that look like a conscious thing would produce. But that there is actually something it is like to be me. That experience is genuinely happening in here, and not just the appearance of it. You can't. And I can't prove it about you either. This is called the problem of other minds, and philosophers have been losing sleep over it for centuries, which is their way of saying it's important, and also that they don't have an answer. The basic problem is this. You only ever have direct access to one consciousness. Yours. Everything else, every other person, every animal, everything that behaves as though it has an inner life, you're inferring. You're pattern matching. You're assuming that because something acts like it feels, it does. Usually that assumption is fine, useful even. But it means the question, does this animal feel anything, is harder to answer than it looks, because the tools we use to check are the same ones that might be fooling us. Here's where it gets properly strange. In 1974, a philosopher named Thomas Nagel wrote an essay called, What Is It Like to Be a Bat? The title sounds like a children's book. It is not a children's book. Nagel's point was that a bat navigates the world through echolocation, bouncing sound off surfaces and reading the returning signal with a precision we can barely model mathematically. We can describe that system in extraordinary detail. We can map every neuron involved, and we still have absolutely no idea what it feels like from the inside, whether there's a felt quality to it at all. That felt quality, the redness of red, the pain of pain, the specific texture of any experience, philosophers call qualia. And qualia are the thing that science, so far, cannot touch. Your brain can be scanned, your neurons can be counted, your qualia remain entirely your own. Descartes had a theory about animals. You're going to hate it. René Descartes, 17th century, brilliant, genuinely one of the most important thinkers in Western history, looked at the animal kingdom and concluded that animals were, essentially, biological machines. No soul, no inner experience, no feelings. A dog yelping in pain wasn't suffering. It was just a mechanism producing a sound, the way a clock produces a tick. He called them automata. Living automata, but automata nonetheless. I say this with all due respect to one of history's greatest minds. That is an aggressively wrong take. But here's what makes it worse than just wrong. It was influential. For a very long time, Descartes' framework gave scientists and philosophers a kind of official permission to not worry about it. If animals don't have inner lives, then the question of what they experience is a non-question. You can set it aside. You can move on. And for roughly 300 years, a lot of people did exactly that. The practical consequences of this were not abstract. Vivisection, surgery performed on fully conscious animals in order to study how bodies work, was practiced openly, defended philosophically, and sometimes conducted with the explicit argument that the screams were not evidence of suffering, but simply the sound of a mechanism under stress. A broken gear, a stuck valve. That's not a medieval position. That's a position with footnotes. What shifted things wasn't a single discovery or a single scientist. It was the slow, uncomfortable accumulation of evidence that animals were doing things that machines simply don't do. They formed bonds, they mourned, they played, they made choices that looked, from the outside, less like programming and more like preference. The automata were behaving as if they had opinions, which is not something Descartes had a clean answer for. His framework didn't collapse overnight. It eroded, and the question he'd spent so much effort burying came back up through the cracks, bigger and stranger than before. So science needed a test, something concrete, something measurable, something that could at least gesture at the question without requiring you to climb inside an animal's head. In 1970, a psychologist named Gordon Gallup Jr. came up with one. He put a chimpanzee in front of a mirror, not a window, not another chimp, a mirror. And what he was watching for was whether the chimp understood that the reflection was itself, not a stranger, not a threat, just its own face looking back, the way you do, without thinking about it, every morning. The chimps figured it out. They used the mirror to examine parts of themselves they'd never seen before, the inside of their mouths, marks painted on their foreheads while they slept. They weren't reacting to a stranger. They were checking themselves out. And Gallup argued that this, recognizing yourself as a continuous, distinct entity in space, was a marker of self-awareness, a sign that something like a self was in there. This became known as the mirror self-recognition test, and for a while it felt like a clean dividing line. Great apes passed, most other animals didn't. The world made sense. Then, in 2019, a fish passed it. A cleaner wrasse, a small reef fish, roughly the length of your finger, was marked with a colored spot and placed in front of a mirror. It scraped the spot against a rock. Not a random behavior, a targeted, specific attempt to remove something it had seen on its own reflection, which is either self-recognition or the most elaborate coincidence in the history of marine biology. If this is the kind of thing that gets you, drop a like, leave a comment. It genuinely helps. Anyway, the scientific community's response was, diplomatically, divided. Some researchers said the test itself was flawed, that passing it doesn't necessarily mean what Gallup thought it meant. Others said that if a fish can do this, we need to seriously reconsider what we think a fish is. A finger-length fish. A mirror. A spot on its own chin. The question just got a lot less tidy. The mirror test is one kind of evidence, but there's another kind, and it's messier, and honestly, it hits harder. Watch what animals do when no one's testing them. Bumblebees in a 2017 study were observed rolling tiny wooden balls around for no apparent reason. No food reward, no training, no obvious function. Just rolling. Younger bees did it more than older ones, which is either irrelevant or the most relatable thing you've ever heard. Researchers called it play behavior, which is a very careful scientific phrase for they were doing it because they wanted to. Then there's the pessimism finding, which, I'm sorry, I cannot get over. When bees experience something stressful, a simulated predator attack, they subsequently show a bias toward negative expectations in ambiguous situations. They assume the bad outcome. They become, measurably, more pessimistic. The researchers describe this as a negative cognitive bias, which is their very restrained way of saying that bees, after a bad experience, feel something that functions like anxiety. A bumblebee, rolling a wooden ball, worried about what comes next. Now swing to something larger. Elephants. When a member of their group dies, return to the body. They stand over it. They touch it with their trunks, the face, the tusks, the places they would have touched in life. They do this for hours, sometimes days. They've been observed doing it with the bones of elephants they knew, years after the death, recognizing them by touch alone in a pile of other bones. You can describe that behavior in purely mechanical terms if you want to. You can call it a response to an unusual stimulus. You can use words like thanatological investigation and keep a straight face. But here's the thing. The behavior looks like grief because it has all the structural features of grief. It's prolonged. It's specific to individuals they knew. It involves returning. And grief, in any creature that experiences it, implies something about what was lost. It implies that the living animal knew, in some way, that the dead one had been alive. All of that evidence, the mirror, the wooden balls, the elephant standing in the dark over someone they loved, runs into the same wall. We can describe the behavior. We cannot reach the experience. This is what philosopher David Chalmers named the hard problem of consciousness, and it is hard in a very specific way. The easy problems, not actually easy, just easier, are things like explaining how the brain processes information, how it integrates signals, how it produces behavior. Those are difficult, but they're the kind of difficult that more research can chip away at. The hard problem is different. It asks why any of that processing is accompanied by experience at all. Why isn't it just computation happening in the dark with no one home to feel it? We don't have an answer. Not even close. Go back to Nagel's bat for a second. A bat navigates by echolocation. It sends out a pulse of sound and reads the world through what bounces back. You can model that system in extraordinary mathematical detail. You can trace every neural pathway involved. And you still cannot know what it is like to be the bat in the moment the signal returns. Whether there's a felt quality to it. Whether the dark is experienced as dark. That gap between the description and the experience is exactly where the animal consciousness question lives. And it's not a gap we're about to close. A philosopher named Frank Jackson once proposed a thought experiment about a scientist named Mary who knows every physical fact about color but has lived her whole life in a black and white room. The day she walks out and sees red for the first time, does she learn something new? Most people's gut says yes, which means the physical description was missing something. We don't know what that something is. Science can describe the behavior, philosophy can sharpen the question, but the actual inner experience, locked away, inaccessible, possibly forever, remains on the other side of a wall we have not found a door in. And I find that both deeply frustrating and, somehow, the most interesting thing about being alive. Assume for a moment that consciousness isn't binary, not on or off, not present or absent. A spectrum, a long, uneven gradient running from something very simple all the way up to whatever is happening inside a human being reading philosophy at 2 in the morning. That's actually the more defensible position, and it makes everything stranger. At one end, you've got creatures with nervous systems so minimal that experience feels like the wrong word entirely. At the other, great apes who form coalitions, hold grudges, and have been observed consoling each other after conflicts in ways that look, structurally, identical to what you'd do for a friend. In the middle, and this is where it gets genuinely vertiginous, you've got the octopus. An octopus has roughly 500 million neurons, which is not far off a small mammal. But 3/5 of those neurons aren't in its brain. They're distributed across its 8 arms, each of which can taste, touch, and make local decisions without consulting the central brain at all. The arms can solve problems semi-independently, which means an octopus isn't just a different kind of mind, it might be something closer to 8 minds loosely coordinated by a 9th. And here's the detail that genuinely stops me cold. Octopuses are colorblind. Their eyes contain only one type of photoreceptor, which means they shouldn't be able to distinguish color at all. But their skin, the skin they use to produce those extraordinary, rippling camouflage displays, is covered in light-sensitive cells. They may be seeing color through their skin. Experiencing light across their entire body surface simultaneously in a way that has no human analog, no frame of reference, nothing you can even partially map onto your own experience. Nagel asks what it's like to be a bat. That question had an answer you could at least gesture at. Darkness, sound, speed. The octopus question doesn't even have a gesture available. Whatever is happening inside that animal, if anything is happening, it is not a dimmer version of what's happening inside you. It's something else entirely. A different shape of being alive, if that's what it is. Here's where the question stops being philosophical and starts being something else. If animals exist on a spectrum of consciousness, if they experience their lives in ways that are real, even if we can't fully access them, then the way we treat them isn't just a preference or a cultural habit. It's a moral question, and not a small one. The Cambridge Declaration on Consciousness, signed in 2012 by a group of prominent neuroscientists at a conference that Stephen Hawking attended, stated formally that non-human animals possess the neurological substrates that generate conscious states. Birds. Octopuses. All mammals. The declaration wasn't a discovery. The researchers involved had known the evidence for years. What it was, more honestly, was an admission. A group of scientists deciding that the professional consensus had been quietly avoiding something it shouldn't avoid anymore. Roughly 1 billion land animals move through industrial farming systems every single week. That number is large enough to stop meaning anything, which is part of the problem. So try it this way. More land animals are processed in a single week than there are humans on Earth. And the conditions those animals experience, the confinement, the separation, the absence of anything that looks like choice or play or preference, are conditions we now have substantial reason to believe are not just unpleasant in a mechanical sense, but experienced as suffering in something that functions like the way you experience suffering. That's not a comfortable sentence to sit with. I'm not going to pretend it is. The science Science doesn't tell you what to do with that. It can't. But it does make certain positions harder to hold without noticing you're holding them. The idea that animal welfare is a sentimental concern, a soft topic, a thing for people who anthropomorphize too much, that position was always resting on the assumption that the animals weren't really there in any meaningful sense. Descartes' automata, the screaming machine. The Cambridge Declaration didn't just complicate that assumption, it signed its name to the complication, in public, with footnotes. What you do with that is, genuinely, up to you. Go back to the couch. Your dog is still there, or he was before he heard something in the kitchen and wandered off. Because that's what dogs do. They live entirely in the pull of the next thing. No past to regret, no future to dread, just the couch, and then the sound, and then whatever the sound turns out to be. We used to think that was evidence of a lesser kind of existence, the absence of self-reflection as a deficit. But spend enough time with this question and that framing starts to feel like it has it exactly backwards. Your dog doesn't contemplate his mortality. He doesn't lie awake at 3 in the morning constructing elaborate scenarios in which everything goes wrong. He doesn't ask whether his life has meaning, because asking that question requires a particular kind of metacognition that might be, and I think this is genuinely worth sitting with, more burden than gift. He just is. Fully, presently, without commentary. Whether that constitutes knowing he's alive depends entirely on what you mean by knowing, and that, it turns out, is not a question with a clean answer. It might be a question with no answer at all, not because we haven't looked hard enough, but because the looking is being done by the very thing we're trying to examine. Consciousness investigating consciousness, a torch trying to illuminate itself. What we do know, what the bees and the elephants and the wrasse and the Cambridge Declaration and 50 years of increasingly uncomfortable neuroscience have quietly assembled into a case, is that experience, in some form, is not uniquely ours. The lights are on in more places than we thought. How brightly, and what the light looks like from inside, we genuinely cannot say. But your dog on that couch is not nothing. He's not a machine producing the appearance of contentment. Something is happening in there. Something that is, in some way we don't fully have words for yet, his. He's not asking whether he's alive. Maybe he already knows.